Thank you, Mr. President. One of the greatest challenges we have is climate change. We are seeing the cost of inaction. The floodings that are occurring very frequently here in the United States and around the world, the forest fires that we've experienced here in the United States, droughts, extreme weather events occurring more frequently, including in my own state, where we had 2 100-year floods within 20 months in Ellicott City, Maryland. Climate migrants, people who no longer can live in their communities because of the rising sea levels. It's an urgent issue for us to address. So I want to share with my colleagues the recent CODEL I led to the COP27 climate discussions in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. I was joined in that CODEL with Senator Whitehouse and Senator Markey. We were there November 10th through the 12th for approximately 2.5 days. COP27 is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It was my 4th conference that I have led senators to attend to deal with the climate issues with the international community. My first was in 2015, COP21 in Paris, in which the U.S. leadership under the Obama administration was able to bring together the global community to a commitment that we needed to limit the rising rising temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we also needed that commitment among all nations, and we got that in Paris. It was a major accomplishment thanks to U.S. leadership. I returned to a COP23 meeting in 2017 in Bonn. That's when President Trump had withdrawn the United States from the climate discussions and from Paris. We were there to make it clear that the United States was still committed to our participation in doing what is responsible to reverse the trend of rising climate heat. I then attended the COP meeting in 2021, in COP26 in Glasgow. I was pleased to report at that time with my colleagues that America was back. This was after President Trump had withdrawn. President Biden re-engaged the United States in the global climate discussions. We were very strong in our language, but the international community wanted to know if the United States would back those words with actions. So, Mr. President, I was very pleased that in 2022, at the COP27 meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh, we could say, in fact, that the United States was back, that we have acted, we have taken action. And I must tell you, the international community was very impressed by what we've been able to do in this Congress, what the Biden administration's been able to do on the climate agenda. In fact, Mr. President, one complaint I got is that from our traditional allies that we may have done too much and they're not sure they can compete with us in regards to the renewable energy industry. That's a nice situation for us to be in as the leader of the world. So we talked about the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was our first major investment into electric vehicle infrastructure for green infrastructure. But the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act was a game changer. It was the largest investment in climate change by a nation ever. $369 billion we were able to get done. It provided many incentives in many different buckets and areas in order to deal with our commitment to reduce emissions. It provided incentives for electric vehicles. It provided incentives for a battery supply chain here in the United States. It provided incentives for offshore wind, a major renewable energy source. And the list goes on and on and on. It included a major commitment on environmental justice, because we know vulnerable communities are more vulnerable. Those that are the traditionally underserved communities are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We need to make sure that we help these communities deal with these challenges. The bottom line, that what we could report at the COP27 conference is the United States is on target to meet our emission goals. We've taken decisive action in order to achieve the goals that President Biden announced of a 50 to 52% reduction in emissions over our 2005 levels. That was good news for the international community and provided, I think, the type of energy in Egypt that allowed us to make progress. We were there for 2.5 days. We had over 30 meetings. I must tell you, we were a popular group. Many countries wanted to meet with us, and we had a lot of bilateral meetings. We do this because we recognize that every country must meet its goals if we're going to be able to achieve the emission reductions that are necessary. So we made ourselves available to listen to the concerns of other countries. Some of them were our traditional allies that are fully industrialized nations. Some of them were developing countries. We all understood that we all need to find a way to meet our emission reductions goals if we're going to be able to avert the most severe consequences of climate change. So we met with many foreign officials. We met with the UN officials that are responsible to conduct the conference. We got a good briefing as to the politics of trying to get 190 plus nations together on the same page on these issues. It's not an easy task. We met with global business leaders. We met with the indigenous community leaders because the indigenous communities, particularly in the developing countries, are the ones who are the most vulnerable. They're living under very difficult circumstances. And when we ask them not to deforest the land in which they're living on, which they do for farming practices, or we ask them to make certain sacrifices, they're saying, well, why should we be making these sacrifices when the developed nations didn't do that way back when? So we need to be concerned about the welfare of all these communities. We met with civil society leaders because you cannot have success in a strategy to deal with climate unless we had the buy-in from all of the stakeholders. And yes, we met with our leaders, U.S. leaders. I want to give a special shout out to our former colleagues, John Kerry, who has been one of our principal leaders in negotiating on behalf of the United States and has traveled the world in order to increase countries' commitments to emission reductions. The themes for the 2 days that we were there, there's a theme every day at the COP meetings. One was Decarbonization Day. The other was Adaptation and Agricultural Day. On decarbonization, it was right in message of what we are concerned about. We talked about meetings that we had with the power sector as to how we needed to use the incentives we have in America and globally to have clean energy credits, to bring down the emissions that are being created through the fossil fuels and creating energy. We talked about how we in America can use the credits that are in the Inflation Reduction Act to show the international community how we can all help in reducing emissions. We also had a chance on the Adaptation and Agricultural Day to listen to President Biden. President Biden attended the COP27 meeting and gave, I think, a very important address to all of the conferees about America's leadership. It was Adaptation Day, and the President announced additional funds that America committed to the Adaptation Fund to make it clear that the United States is going to be part of these efforts. I must tell you, we met with the Pakistani delegation. We expressed our condolences over the loss of thousands of citizens of Pakistan to the consistent and continuous flooding that has taken place in that country. A large portion of Pakistan is really not habitable today because of sea level increases and the effects of climate change. Adaptation is very important. They don't have the resources for adaptation. Madam President, I was just at the Naval Academy this past week where we dedicated, we had a groundbreaking for raising the seawall. We have to raise the seawall in order to protect the Naval Academy. That's something we have to do to adapt to the realities that we have more frequent high tide flooding in Annapolis. We have the resources to do that. Pakistan does not have the resources to protect their population. The United States and international community must work on adaptation, but it's not a substitute for mitigation. Our principal way to deal with climate is to make sure we reach our emission goals and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. so that the worst effects can be avoided. Mitigation and adaptation are critically important. We need to do both. Now, I'm going to tell you the most controversial discussions that took place at COP27 dealt with the international climate financing issues. You may have heard about the loss and damage discussions that took place there. And it is controversial. It's not controversial what we're trying to achieve. And I pointed out, and my colleagues, Senator Whitehouse and Senator Markey pointed out, that the United States has been very actively engaged with the developing world to help develop their green infrastructure. We do that through USAID and the work that they do around the world. We do it in the Millennium Challenge grants and the work that they do around the world. We do that in our participation with international banking institutions to provide credit to the developing countries so that they can develop green infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector. And we do that through many bills that we pass here. I'll just give you one example. I'm proud of the Neotropical Migratory Bird Act that I was partially responsible for making sure that we have funded that. Well, that provides grants for habitats for migratory birds. That money is almost all spent in other countries. I was just recently in South America, and they were thanking us for the work that they have done in regards to this program and protecting habitat for migratory birds. So the United States does a lot in regards to international financing. And we share our technology. It's U.S. technology that's being used by these countries in order to develop their infrastructure. Our objective is clear. We want the developing world to have green infrastructure that gives them reliable energy, gives them reliable transportation. We want them to do that without deforestation, without taking away their forests. We want them to do that without using their fossil reserves. And for that, we have to be active participants in the international financing to help them. We are that. We are a reliable global partner. And we made that point over and over again. I'll just give you one more example of how we're helping. Senator Menendez has introduced what's known as Amazon 21, a bill I hope that we can pass in this Congress. It provides help to preserve forestation around the world, named for Amazon, of course, which is the greatest treasure we have in our hemisphere on forest lands that are very much subject to being lost. I joined Senator Menendez in Ecuador recently, and we talked to the leadership there about what they're doing to protect the Amazon. They need help so that the indigenous population does not have to cut down the forest in order to farm. We need to be helpful in that, and Amazon 21 would be the U.S. response to help to maintain the forest. Why do we want to maintain the forest? 20% of the global carbon emissions is occurring through deforestation. It's a huge source to meet our goals that we need to meet. Now, COP27 was held in Egypt, and we could not go to Egypt without mentioning the human rights concerns that we have in that country. Thousands of journalists, protesters, and activists are in jail today without trial, solely because they're trying to report the news or disagree with their government or be environmentalists. That's wrong, and we raised those issues. We met with the families of some of the victims that are in jail today, and we met with the foreign minister of Egypt in order to raise these issues. We will continue to raise these issues and urge the Egyptians to release those that are being held for just expressing their views or being journalists. That's wrong, and they need to be released. And then lastly, Madam President, let me just compliment the U.S. leadership at COP27. I already mentioned Secretary John Kerry. John Kerry has done a great service to this country and to the global community. He's traveled the world and has gotten countries to move a lot further than I think any of us thought it was possible. And I want to congratulate our former colleague for the work that he has done on the climate issues. I want to also acknowledge Assistant Secretary Monica Medina, who worked tirelessly during the COP27 in order to get results. We're certainly not satisfied by everything that happened at COP27. Let me make that clear. There were disappointments. We would like to see an increase in the emission targets, much more than have been made. We have to do better. We've only made modest progress on mitigation. But important progress was made in forest protection. So we did make progress, and we brought the international community together in order to recognize that this is a global problem. And I am so proud that the United States leadership is back on the international scene, leading the international community to do what we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avert the most severe consequences of climate change. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.